Welcome to yet another Crodiaspora webinar. George Kovačić and myself, Goran Šaravanja, 18 months or so ago, we had one on energy, the energy markets in the world and how that relates to Croatia. Given Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the interesting and important stuff happening in energy markets, we thought we'd do it again. This time we'll change the order around. George, who runs Crško International out of Vancouver in Canada, he'll give a global overview. I'm going to sort of get involved in the discussion, and then we'll go through the trends in Croatia and based on George's global overview, see where we fit in and what we can do to make things even better for us. So George, floor's yours.
Brilliant. Thank you for the introduction, Goran. This is going to be exciting. As you said, definitely a lot of changes in the past 18 months. But in reality, there's been a lot of changes, but has much really changed in Croatia is the question. So let's go forward.
Absolutely. I'm not sure that it has. I mean, it has in the sense that the LNG terminal is up and running. So that just buttresses the security of supply. But there's, as we're going to talk about, there's much more that can be done. And it's also in concert with net zero goals. So let's get on.
Indeed, lots of opportunities for Croatia.
Mm-hmm.
So Goran, I just want to make sure you can see the slide.
Yes, I can.
Yep. Okay, so I'll start off. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you, Crodiaspora, Mate, and the excellent team at Crodiaspora for facilitating this webinar. The topic today is energy crisis, turning chaos into opportunity and Croatia's chance. And I thought when I was drafting this presentation, I thought of Churchill when he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And we're definitely having some extraordinary times. And when I look into it, I see extraordinary opportunities for Croatia because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in Croatia, which hasn't been done before. So I think this is a great time.
Yeah, we also might say that it's an irresistible force running into or meeting an unmovable object. So,
I echo your opinion. It's go with the force and develop it to your advantage.
Absolutely.
Perfect analogy. Quick disclaimer, if there's anything you're using for my presentation, please do, but come and talk to me first. So I'm just going to, as Goran said, I'm going to set the global view, and I'm calling it a global full-blown energy crisis. And I'm actually seeing the situation in Europe more of a crisis than other places in the world. And the reason is the price of natural gas, wholesale natural gas. According to the Wall Street Journal last week, and I confirmed it today again, the price of wholesale gas prices in Europe are now 6 times higher than a year ago. And even double prices or triple prices would be an extraordinary event. 6 times, I don't even know what word we use for that. That's extraordinary several times over. So what's happening? We're having skyrocketing energy prices. And the problem really there is the full impact of these skyrocketing prices has not yet, in most places, been passed on to consumers, both homes as well as industrial consumers. Second thing, what's happening as well, and it's not a part of the current energy crisis, is that renewable energy is gaining traction. More and more people are using renewable energy, which is good, but renewable energy is expensive, and that is a problem. Solar and wind, I have no problem with them. I think they're great, but they have a problem that there's no base load capacity. And that's a growing issue. And we've seen this happen over the past several years in Europe, in California, in Texas, in Germany, UK, elsewhere, where just when you need the extra power, solar and wind isn't there. And there's a problem there because when people develop solar and wind, they don't determine the cost, additional cost for base load capacity. So the cost of solar and wind is actually much more than is often discussed in the media. But we do see this often in studies in the industry. Second issue that's happening for renewables as well is, geothermal is great. It provides energy every day, every hour, but it's also much more expensive. Studies I've seen from various jurisdictions in Europe and North America, list geothermal and other renewables as 2 to 4 times more expensive. So renewables are great as long as you have the wherewithal and ability to pay these extra costs. At the same time, we're seeing skyrocketing energy demand. There's been a pullback in the past couple of weeks because of China, but the numbers I've seen is that we've exceeded pre-COVID levels for oil and gas demand in most jurisdictions and significantly. And that's going to grow as soon as China opens up fully again, as well as there's been a lack of investment in oil and gas industry in the past couple of years. So the ramp up of production isn't as strong as everybody anticipated even a couple of months ago. And that, coupled with the strategic petroleum reserve releases, definitely in the US and elsewhere, have been unfortunately ineffective. Any comments there, Goran?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly when we're mentioning skyrocketing energy prices, we should say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the new moment. So I just wanted to mention that elephant in the room. And it's certainly natural gas, which is let's say, the most at risk in the sense that it's much more difficult than oil. It's nowhere near as fungible to start with. And we're seeing that with Germany, which has said, we originally had said, we think that by the end of 2022, we'll be able to win ourselves off Russian oil. Now, with the Lithuanians and the Poles opening up that oil pipeline between the two countries, all of a sudden they're saying we can more or less do it instantly. So the fungibility of oil makes it much less of a risk. And indeed, when you look at Germany's reliance on Russian oil, it's down from 35% to 12%, whereas it's nowhere near as that reduction in reliance on Russian natural gas hasn't gone anywhere near as much or near as far in respect of Germany. And this is the question in respect of obviously winter 22-23. Industrial demand. I would also, I'm not sure that that skyrocketing energy demand is sustainable, because clearly the Euro area and Central and Eastern European economies have been far more directly and deeply hit by this Russian invasion of Ukraine. After all, 4 or 5 countries in the European Union do border with, or 4 actually, border with Ukraine. There's a direct border there. So that economic impact is far more pronounced than in the US and elsewhere. And I'm not sure that these Chinese lockdowns, I mean, personally wouldn't be surprised if they lasted all the way until the 20th Party Congress in November in a significant enough degree to bring that energy demand down. So there's a little bit of a silver lining in a fairly dark cloud, to be perfectly honest, in terms of where energy prices will go. And clearly, what happens in Ukraine over the next couple of months will also have a material impact on clearly the price of natural gas. Although looking out beyond this year and next, I mean, you just wouldn't want to be Russia, because I mean there is movement happening in Europe. Short term, more coal, more fossil fuels to make sure that people can, first of all, be heated during the winter. Then there will clearly be a ramp up in nuclear, which we'll talk about more at the EU level. That's medium term. And longer term, there's going to be a renewed push to improve renewables technology, storage of electricity, all sorts of things that we can't even imagine today. And in that context, you just wouldn't want to be Russia 5-10 years out from now in terms of who you're going to sell your hydrocarbons to.
Yeah, Goran, I agree with you completely. It's very dynamic. There's going to be a lot of changes. And, if we think back 6 months or 3 months ago, no one would have been able to predict what's happening today.
No
and there's no way we can predict what's going to happen 3 months from now.
No, we can't. But I think also it's important to say that, democracies have proven time and again that they're far more resilient than dictatorships.
Indeed.
Either side of it. I don't care whether it's left, right, and how far left or right. I mean, you can see how brittle China is, and you can see how brittle Russia is. I mean, the types of miscalculations, even when they happen in the West, and everyone knows that they've happened, we've dealt with a lot. You're still much more flexible because you're allowed to say what you think.
Indeed. And it's that independent thought process and exchange of ideas that gets the best ideas.
Exactly, and it's slow and it looks cumbersome and ineffective. Yep. But when it gets serious, you can see that democracies work. And you look at Germany, all the criticism they've gotten since the 24th of February and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, been justified to a large extent. And let's say it's been self-generated, because 30 years of their foreign and energy policies in the space of 2 months have fallen apart.
Indeed.
To an extent. And Germany's been in a state of shock. And let's be honest, everyone would be in their situation. But
Indeed.
They're dealing with it. I mean, today's the 3rd of May. A couple of days ago in Düsseldorf, Chancellor Scholz had a very, very impassioned defense of providing weapons to Ukraine in front of pacifist protesters. Mm-hmm. And, I'm sure that Germany will find a way. For all the criticism that I think a large part of it has been, justified and, brought on by herself, but I'm sure that Germany will find a way to readjust. It's not going to happen overnight. And clearly the European Union will also be stronger, which is good for Croatia as the newest member state.
I agree with you. And it reminds me of discussions 5-6 years ago regarding building the LNG terminal in Croatia. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of naysayers and very passionate arguments by people from I went to a conference in Zagreb, a couple actually from the US and the Baltics, saying how it's important to build the LNG terminal. That's because right. The fundamentals remain the same. And that is energy security, diversification. And that's the opportunity Croatia has.
That's right.
And this is an opportunity, this is a chance to actually make this happen, because in a democracy like Croatia, you need the public consultations. Yep. And that's what's happening right now. So I'm going to call this, there's a chaos going on. And I'm going to explain why. As we mentioned before, the prices are skyrocketing. Demand has skyrocketed, definitely from COVID lows. We don't know what's going to happen moving forward, but it's growing. Couple of concerns I've noticed is the European Commission stated before the pandemic that 34 million Europeans were not able to adequately heat their homes. There hasn't been anything recent numbers up from the European Commission or anybody else in the last while, but I found various statements by various officials stating that number is probably 2 or 3 times higher right now on a European basis, okay? Mm-hmm. EU basis. And it could be, depending what happens in the next 6 months, substantially worse next winter. We don't know, okay? But it's a concern because we're talking, up to a quarter of Europeans, and that number would be higher in Central Europe, will have problems heating their homes. And this is an issue. This is a huge issue. And we can just take a look what's happened in the past few years when the prices were not high, when there wasn't increasing demand. And that is, and not only in Europe, but elsewhere around the world, blackouts, brownouts, electricity grid collapses. There's concern this could continue. One issue as well, as I touched about solar and wind before not providing baseload capacity. I mean, there is great opportunities to build infrastructure for grids. But, from studies I've looked at, and I was involved in a couple of projects in 2020 and 2021, this will take decades. It's just a reality. It's not going to happen right away. Some of the points I've seen, even if everybody started today, there's not enough equipment, companies, technology, steel to get this done quickly. It just can't be done. It's going to take decades. What is this energy poverty resulting in? More poverty. We're having inflation. We've had riots in places like Peru and Africa. We're having geopolitical contention. We're seeing that happen right now. I mean, for example, the European Union stated last week or 2 weeks ago that they're going to have a joint policy, EU policy for natural gas imports. But countries are moving forward independently, like Italy, and they're signing agreements because they have that advantage. And he's strong. They have agreements. They've developed pipelines. So they're going forward independently. This is good. The Italians can always make an arrangement for the European Union to get that extra gas. But, there's a lot of chaos happening right now. The biggest problem is food. What's going to happen to the price of food? I mean, being cold or cool in the winter is not comfortable, but there's going to be a lot of people that may not be able to buy the basics, and this is food. And we'll touch a bit about that because the cost of the fertilizers are increasing. I've read some articles in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. They're predicting regime change. They're saying, if the governments are not able to keep their citizens warm and well fed, things will happen. And then, of course, we have an issue of environmental degradation, and we'll touch about that as well. Any comments, Goran, before I go to the next slide?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say in the context of the European Union, one thing that, I mean, it clearly all depends on how Ukraine goes, how long the war lasts, what happens, how that impacts directly on natural gas prices specifically. I would say that we saw during the pandemic that the EU jointly, procured vaccines, right? Which for smaller member states like Slovenia, like Croatia, like the Baltics, independently, we'd never be able to get those conditions that the EU managed to negotiate. I think because clearly the political risk is massive, heading into winter, depending on how things develop, that you will see some sort of, there's a high chance now that since we've already done it once in the EU, that you may have some sort of a European Commission coordinated approach, specifically in terms of natural gas procurement or sharing. I mentioned when we were commenting the previous slide, the Lithuania-Poland oil pipeline, all of the infrastructures there, Croatia's LNG, whatever else. I mean, there will be an attempt to soften the blow. The European Union it's the wealthiest single market on earth. So, I mean, there's no shortage of funds at EU level if, just like the job protection schemes they had during the pandemic, we need some sort to get us through winter 2022-23. That is something that you can expect because, again, you mentioned regime change, looking at it obviously globally, but clearly we're talking about a group of the wealthiest democracies on earth, or amongst the wealthiest, and there's many more policy degrees of freedom there. So clearly, regime change is not something that you're expecting. You would put too high a number on in Europe.
Not in Europe. Again, I mentioned South America, where there's been riots occurring, and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where the problem is, because even a 10 or 15 or 20% increase in staples like corn is huge.
Yeah, and food prices are the number one risk for the reasons that you mentioned. You're absolutely right. I agree completely.
And I'm going to say there's panic going on. And the reason I'm going to say there's panic going on is, well, everything we heard up to February this year, in many ways, regarding the energy transition has been thrown out, it appears, in the past 60 days or past 65 or 70 days now. One thing I heard not long ago is that Germany would not be mining more coals. There was various challenge. Well, a German court ruled, last month or a couple months ago now, that bulldozing homes, I understand churches and old towns for mining of coal is legal, which I was told in articles I read wouldn't happen. All of a sudden, because of the new dynamics, it's happening. And this is also happening in Croatia's neighborhood in Southeastern Europe. Many of the countries, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Northern Macedonia, are moving forward to producing more energy, more electricity from coal. And that, 2-3 months ago was unthinkable.
Yeah, and not only
here we
them,
are in
to
new
be honest.
environment. I'm sorry?
Not only them, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, even like, for example, the most popular politician, according to the latest opinion polls in Germany, is Robert Habeck, who is the co-head of the Greens.
Yep.
He's the economy minister, and perhaps I hadn't had a chance to check it. I think he's also a deputy prime minister, but in any event, and he hasn't beaten around the bush. He said the period or the era of low energy prices in Germany is over.
Yep.
Bear in mind, again, I'll underline it. He's the most popular German politician, together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, who is also from the Greens. And, he's gone out to Qatar and negotiated, gas supply deals. When they build the LNG, they're building one at the moment. They're planning another 3. They're increasing coal production because, politically, people need to be warm in winter. And if I had to bet, I'm not a betting man, but if I had to bet, industry will shut down if it needs to, but people will have access to heat in winter in a democracy. The same thing would happen in a dictatorship. But I mean, it's important, again, to stress, this guy is the most popular politician. He's green. He's saying, well, listen, we've got to be realistic. And this is where we're going back to, an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. That's the comment that I made initially. So it demonstrates a pragmatism. It demonstrates, again, compare that to Xi Jinping in China, who has put Shanghai in lockdowns, and perhaps even Beijing, who has zero COVID policy and cannot structurally, because he runs a totalitarian regime, admit that he's wrong. A green minister in a German government can say, well, listen, events have happened. The world has changed, and short term, we are going to increase coal usage to make sure that we have enough energy for people and for the economy. Again, it's the strength of a democracy.
Brilliant example. Thank you. Brilliant example, because it shows how democracies function and they do what's best for their population. I noticed that coal prices have reached record highs. I noticed that coal demand has reached record highs. And again, 2-3 months ago, I think no one could have predicted this.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to call it the perfect storm. And the reason I'm calling it the perfect storm, usually when people hear about oil, gas, and coal, they think about heating and they think about fuel for transportation. Yep. And that's it. All these other items, which cover every facet of our life, all of our industries, are often forgotten. But the majority of hydrocarbons actually doesn't go for transportation, and that's forgotten. One key component which isn't on this list, I mean, there's so many great lists out there available of what hydrocarbons go for, is fertilizers. And this is so important because it echoes what Goran was saying for the last slide, is that there's been fertilizer plants that have curtailed production, that have shut down production. And this is because the price of natural gas, which is a key component in fertilizers, has gone up 6-fold in Europe. Much less elsewhere, but 6-fold in Europe. And this is a key concern right now because of the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a breadbasket or grain basket, as is Russia. And now to have less fertilizers being produced, less acreage planted, it's a perfect storm, because there's a lot of immovable forces, like what I mentioned, that are coming together. And unfortunately, it's going to result in higher prices for food, not just energy. And that is a problem.
It is a problem, but not having access to food or energy is a bigger problem.
Indeed.
Especially when you have the fortune to live in a wealthy country like Canada, or in a grouping of countries like the EU, where there are resources to help you out.
Yeah. So that's why I'm calling it the perfect storm. But whenever there is great problems or extraordinary problems, there's great opportunities. And I think that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. There is a great route forward for Croatia. Absolutely. I've always said in Croatia, and I've been coming there for decades now, actually since '93, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in Croatia. And I think often we're like my 8-year-old. Instead of, maybe it's in our DNA, instead of just picking the fruit from the tree, the low-hanging fruit, we like to put on our suit and ties, and this was him after his Kovačić, his first communion, going up onto the tree to pick the plums. It's more fun this way. It takes a bit longer. It's more fun, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in Croatia. And that's what's exciting about it. There's a lot of opportunities forward. It's important moving forward to ensure that you're not damaging the environment. Let me snooze this. It's important that you're not damaging the environment. One thing I've noticed in Croatia, particularly from the late 70s and 80s when I started coming to Croatia on holidays, is there's been a regreening of Croatia. A lot of trees have grown in places where they didn't exist before. And I've even noticed that in the past 15, 20 years after getting married. I went to my wife's village, where she's originally from, born in Canada, but where her family's originally from. And in 2003, there was not many trees, and now it's a forest. And a lot of that has happened because of hydrocarbons. People have fuel to cook, people have fuel to heat. And we don't want to go back to the 1930s. And this is a picture from Lika, from Hrvatska šuma. So thank you, Hrvatska šuma, for providing these photos. We can see what's happened in the decades. Trees have grown. People are using vehicles. It's providing carbon sinks. It's providing habitat for nature. It's protecting our water supply and so forth. Goran, you have some comments?
No, I don't. I agree.
You agree. Okay. And I mean, the big issue here is, this is always a surprise for me. And actually, my friends that went to Croatia, they would see in towns and cities wood stockpiled in front of high-rise buildings. And they would ask me, okay, why is there wood here? And I would say, well, people use it for heating in the wintertime. And they couldn't understand that because, usually in September, even in August, people start buying wood. And one thing I'm worried about is what I've seen is the price of wood has gone up a lot in Croatia. I've checked with some of the sources over there. And apparently, even in the past year, there's been a lot more trees chopped down, which is not good. I mean, it's better to have, heat and food, but we want to ensure that our forests, we don't go back to the 1930s the way it looked in Croatia, or even the 1970s and 80s. Mm-hmm. So we want to move forward with a smart energy transition in Croatia, okay, where we protect our forests, our watersheds, our waterways, our wildlife, where we have the cash, or the government has cash, to subsidize geothermal and non-baseload capacity renewables such as wind and solar. And I'm going to get to the point I'm getting to very shortly here, actually right now. The only way we can do that right now in Croatia is to produce the resources we have in the country, and that is hydrocarbons. I'm confident there's more hydrocarbons. By hydrocarbons, that's oil and gas in the Adriatic. Now, we know in the past, the government take for production of hydrocarbons was about 10%, but with the change of the fiscal regimes, that's about 50% now. And that's a lot of money, particularly in the numbers that Croatia now pays for hydrocarbons, and Goran will get to that in his presentation, which would come to the state. This is a lot of money that the taxpayer or the government can then have to subsidize renewables. A key area that Croatia can develop as well, and where Croatia is a leader, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And as everybody knows in the oil and gas industry, we call that enhanced oil recovery. Croatia commenced their first enhanced oil recovery back in 2014 in Sisak, the Žutica fields, and it's going very well. So Croatia has done a great job of sequestering carbon and increasing production of hydrocarbons. It's a win-win. Another area for smart energy transition that's happening throughout the European Union and North America and elsewhere is they're saying, fine, move forward with additional oil and gas exploration and production onshore and offshore, but put in emission caps, put in checkpoints to make sure that we're still proceeding to reduce carbon, to reduce pollution. And that can be done. A key component there, of course, is carbon capture, energy storage. And if we take a look at hydrogen has been a key discussion point in Croatia over the past months. As we know, a key feedstock for hydrogen is natural gas. So why is carbon capture, utilization, and storage important? Well, I'm just going to quote the experts. IAE stated in their report, which is available online, reaching net zero will be virtually impossible without carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I'm confident that it is impossible. Like I said, Croatia has been successful with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I believe there's many opportunities for carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Slovenia, in the Pannonian Basin. I'm quite confident that this will be possible in Northern Adriatic, both on the Croatian and Italian side, where there's been production of natural gas for decades. And this falls in line with the oil and gas industry. Currently, about 500,000 barrels of oil per day are used by producing carbon capture and storage. And about 70% of CO2 captured comes from oil and gas operations. And this is complementary. You produce oil and gas and you store the carbon. It's a win-win. Go on, some comments there.
I've got nothing to add here, man. I'm an economist. You spent more time in your career in this industry, so let's just leave it there.
Perfect. Well, it's good to chat. It's always good to chat.
It is, yeah.
We're democratic. It's good to have viewpoints and different viewpoints.
You know what they say. When you know less, then you listen and you learn.
I agree. And it's important, as Croatia is a part of a big team, the European Union, it's important to follow something that aligns with other EU members. And what we've seen in the past couple of months is, leading EU member Germany saying, yes, we're open to additional drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea. We've heard the Greeks saying we're going to promise additional exploration of oil and gas in their seas, and they have many more seas than Croatia, and actually very dependent on tourism as well. And I'm just going to give a German example that I gave 18 months ago, because I think it's very, very, well, very important, is even 18 months ago, Germany did not stop their offshore oil production. In fact, they continued to produce in a national park in the shallow waters about 6 kilometers off coast. Why does Germany do it? Because it provides them reliable, efficient, and stable supply of energy. And they also make sure that there is no, or actually minimal impact on the environment, much less than you would have for importing additional crude.
Yeah.
To provide another example, and this is a Deloitte study for Romania. And I like these EU examples because, well, Croatia's in the EU. Romania, of course, has the Black Sea. They've had production there for decades. They've had some hiccups because they changed their fiscal regime about 4 years ago. That's been changed back to the way it was recently. And that's going to increase investment offshore Romania and production of hydrocarbons in offshore Romania. What does this mean for the country? Well, the Deloitte study said tens of thousands of jobs. The 2018 Deloitte study also said contribution of 7 billion USD annually. And that's from the prices back of 2018. For today's prices, we're talking substantially higher. But it also provides a feedstock for the country. And I chaired a conference in Romania a couple of years ago. Actually, that would have been 2018 as well. And the ministers were saying, you know, Romania has a lot of resources. It's a relatively large country. It has a relatively large population. It has great soil. It has great water. But the one thing we're missing to become the leading, you know, agricultural producer of Europe is inexpensive natural gas. Because with inexpensive natural gas or own the supply of natural gas, you know, Romania could compete against Holland, which is now having less production of natural gas. And a lot of the agricultural products, the tomatoes, the peppers, the cucumbers that Holland supplies to not only all of Europe, but globally, could be coming from Romania in the near future. And that's one of their goals. So like we mentioned in an earlier slide, energy is important for every component of life, not just heat and transportation. It's important for food, plastics, everything.
And I mean, let's be honest, given what's happened in Europe in the last few months, you know, again, Ukraine, no one is going to criticize you if you do something to increase your access or production, domestic production of hydrocarbons. Not in this situation. And, you know, the fact is that, you know, as you said, George, I mean, it can be in line with net zero, you know, goals. So, I mean, you know, the fact is that the world has changed fairly significantly, you know, since we've entered to 2022. And you've got to be pragmatic and, you know, accept the facts and do what you can to soften the blow of, you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the economic impacts on the European Union, and to make sure that your citizens and your businesses can function.
I echo your opinions. You know, I wanted to put in a couple of additional slides. I think it's really important because this is a topic I've been discussing for 4 or 5 years, and that is illegal oil dumps in Croatia. According to the European Commission study, illegal oil dumps occur regularly in Croatian Adriatic, actually in Italian Adriatic as well. If you take a look at the red dots on the map, these are slicks that the European Commission via satellites has found in the Adriatic during a study they did about a decade ago. Unfortunately, they keep on happening. Now, these slicks correspond to the main shipping routes. It's very tough to determine if a tanker dumped something out because it usually occurs at nighttime. And usually I understand they take in some water and then dump sludge into the Adriatic. This is horrible. This is one of the risks of importing oil. And by producing your own oil and natural gas, you minimize this risk. Another point I'd like to point out, and I'm bringing it up as well for some other projects globally, is that there are natural oil and gas seeps in the Adriatic. We've known about them for decades. In fact, our neighbors in Italy have used these seeps to help identify oil and gas reserves in the Adriatic and ultimately to drill and produce these reserves. So in addition to the slicks that are appearing because of potentially tankers dumping sludge and oil into the Adriatic, we also have oil and gas naturally bubbling up and seeping in the Adriatic. This is important because it tells everybody that not only do we have production of natural gas in the northern part of Croatia, as well as along the Italian coast, and oil on the Italian side, but we also have seeps. Now, many in the oil and gas industry would know that one of the largest finds ever done in the oil and gas industry was done by a Mexican fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico. And he came to Pemex, the national oil company of Mexico, many decades ago and said, you guys have a leak and are dumping oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And they say, look at my mesh, my fishing nets. And they said, okay, where are you fishing? And he went out and showed them, and there was a seep. There was oil bubbling to the surface of the sea. And that resulted in being one of the largest discoveries ever globally. And for decades, they were producing well over 100,000 barrels a day. I'm not saying that's going to happen in Croatia at all, but I'm going to say that these show and prove that there's active petroleum systems in play in the Adriatic elsewhere where there's currently not production. So what is Croatia's chance? What is Croatia's advantage? It's its offshore advantaged hydrocarbons. I'm using the word advantaged because that specifies oil and gas that'll be produced last. So this is oil and gas that has particularly oil, that has what is sweet, that is light, so less carbon emissions. And it's also oil and gas that is close to infrastructure, like Croatia, where we have infrastructure in the north and where we have Italian infrastructure in the south. So these are the molecules that will be produced the last. It's also important for oil and gas that is close to markets, like Croatia. There is a carbon footprint of bringing in oil and gas from the Middle East, from Russia before, and elsewhere. So it's easier to produce it, less environmentally damaging to do it domestically at home, not to mention having all the extra funds to subsidize renewables. Also important to mention is that the existing hydrostatic pressures in Croatia and the Adriatic prevent any type of disasters. It is much, much more likely there'll be a disaster in Croatia by importing oil than producing your own. And I'm going to state also that Croatia's most successful tourist area, Istra, is the area that is closest to the production of natural gas in the Adriatic. And also state, I've been to Venice a number of times, and anybody that's been there, if you look, you'll see production platforms just outside the bay. And Venice by itself has more income from tourism than all of Croatia. Of course, Venice has a lot of stuff going for it, but the oil industry, the gas industry there has not hindered that whatsoever. Goran, any comments?
Oh, as I said, you're the resident expert on oil and gas. So, yeah.
Thank you. To summarize, Croatia's advantaged are the country's offshore oil and gas, its advantaged hydrocarbons. There is 203 offshore leads have been identified. Of course, additional seismic has to be acquired. There has to be drilling. There has to be appraisal wells. I've had some conversations over the past couple of months. How quickly can Croatia produce new reserves? To be realistic, it's going to take 5 years. I mean, there's been miracles done in Zohar, for example, in Egypt, where any production on within 3 years, but that's unlikely. So let's look at 5 years. And yes, there is interest from oil and gas companies to explore and produce oil and gas in Croatia, definitely both offshore and onshore. And as we spoke before, Croatia is a leader already for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I'm confident there'll be more potential. And, to use the analogy of the plum tree, and I kind of like the plum tree because it means a lot in Croatia. It's not only for, pekmez or jams and knegle, but it's also for rakia. So I guess it's a type of fuel. I see Croatia
and medicine.
and medicine. There you go. So we cover it all. I see Croatia's bowls full. The fruit is low hanging. There's so many opportunities there. The potential is there. There's more than enough for everybody. In fact, Croatia can help its EU neighbors for energy security moving forward.
I mean, I would just comment that the era of low energy prices is over. You mentioned at the start of your presentation that there hasn't been that much investment, or as much as we would have liked, let's say, in oil and gas in the previous 5 years. It's because prices were low. They're likelier for a long enough period to be high enough to justify some of what you've outlined, George. So, and let's be perfectly honest. Engineering potential, knowledge, geological knowledge, it's all necessary. But
yes,
none of that is sufficient until it works out on your P&L. And that is sometimes something which is sort of seeps through the cracks, if you like, in discussions, not only in Croatia, but in the region in general. But it's extremely important to underline that this has to be financially. It has to be sustainable. And I mean, obviously, in the context of, ESG policies and whatever else, which, you would expect now, given the energy crisis, which you mentioned, are going to take a back seat for a little while anyway. You will be able to say, well, if it makes sense on your P&L and with higher energy prices in the medium term, because of the structural factors you mentioned, it's likelier that these things are going to pay off. So yeah, from that perspective, the outlook is arguably more positive than what it was 18 months ago.
I echo your opinion. I agree. I'm going to give a couple more slides, and you may have seen these slides before. A lot of discussion in Croatia. Last time there was plans for new additional drilling in Croatia. And just so we all understand, INA has not stopped drilling in the Northern Adriatic. This has been ongoing over the past 18 months. And it's been key because it's providing Croatia with additional natural gas just when the country needs it.
Yeah, exactly. They recently announced, a 7 percentage point increase in natural gas production once one of the two, wells that they've developed come online.
I like to use Greece as an example because their percentage of GDP to tourism is actually higher than Croatia. They're also a larger country, a larger economy, but they are producing oil offshore in a tourist area. It's going very well. If you take a look at the slide here, this is from a blue flag beach. This beach, you can see the platforms here, they're barely visible. But what's happened in this region of Greece and other areas that have offshore production, the tourist season has become 12 months. Why? Because people have full-time jobs. They are paid 12 months a year. They have families, they have functioning restaurants and theaters, and people from the cold Europe, from the north, like to come to the south, even in November, December, February, and March, and enjoy the warmer climates of Greece. And this is possible because of oil and gas, because it's brought people to the area. They haven't had to leave and work in Germany. They can actually work at home. And I'll give another example. This is Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara, as we all know, is a part of Los Angeles, but it all grew up over oil development. This island here, which looks like a hotel and a resort complex, is actually one of the 4 islands off Long Beach, off Santa Barbara, that produces over 100,000 barrels of offshore oil a day. These were built in the 60s. Later came the marina. Later became the developments and the hotels, as well as the beaches. So it shows that you can successfully have tourism, fishing, offshore oil production. They all actually feed each other. And it's substantially more environmentally friendly because you're not importing the oil. And on top of that, there's less risks because, as I've shown from the previous slides, importation of oil can result in slicks. There are tanker disasters that happen every year. In the Adriatic, with the pressures that exist, these disasters are just not possible.
And it's also important to say, we're talking about EU, Western standards of environmental protection. in every industrial activity that takes place, in every industry, in every subsector, so including oil and gas, clearly. So we're not talking about some Wild West jurisdiction where you can get away with whatever you want.
Indeed, absolutely.
So that as well needs to, again, I think it needs to be said. I mean, even though people know it, I don't think it hurts to repeat it.
I echo your opinion. Thank you for bringing that up. We're going to be taking questions. So if you have a question for me, you can email me on this email. We'll get together, I guess, in a couple of weeks and do a second session and answer all these questions. Yeah. So now I'm pleased and honored to transfer the mic over to my colleague, Goran.
Yep. Right. Well, let's just get straight into it. So that we'll go on to the next slide, George. That's the introduction. That's who I work for. That's my company. My email's at the end of the presentation. Right. So Croatia's energy mix is fairly evenly distributed. The legend at the bottom has been truncated, but I'll explain everything. Don't worry. The top two bars are electricity, and this is European Eurostat data. So the way that they present it is the way clearly I've presented it all, the way they disaggregate it. So anyway, electricity and renewables are the top two. So that's over 30% if you look at 2020. The electricity is the imported stuff. The renewables is hydro, wind, solar, biofuels. Mainly hydro, wind, solar. There's also nuclear in there. Roughly 15% of Croatia's electricity is produced in Slovenia in the jointly owned nuclear power plant at Krško, which is not too far from the Croatian border. So those top two are essentially electricity, what's imported and what's generated through renewables. The next one is oil and petroleum products. That's the 33.7. And then at 30.3 is natural gas. And right down the bottom is something the European Commission or the European Eurostat calls solid fuels, solid fossil fuels, i.e. coal. The squiggly darkish or middle blue line, if you like, is available energy. So it's gone up and down between 8 and, well, let's say between 8 and 9, 1,000 tons of oil equivalent. So all of it is different sources of energy, have different measurements, but to put it all into, make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, we've just used tons of oil equivalent. So, it's a fairly evenly distributed energy mix, which, is not too bad. So the next slide will talk about domestic production. So when you know that you have basically 8,300 tons of oil equivalent of, let's say, available energy. Croatia produced in 2020, 3.8 million, 3,800 tons of oil equivalent energy, all up. Most of that is hydro, wind, solar, nuclear, funnily enough. So when we look at share of production. So what's that saying? It's basically saying, 2,300 tons of oil equivalent in renewables. And that's that wider definition, clearly, includes hydro, includes nuclear, in my opinion, and certainly involves wind and solar. Of domestic production, it's been fairly stable, actually, slightly rising, actually, as a share of domestic production. 19% is oil and oil products. The Rijeka refinery, which is undergoing an upgrade through a delayed coker, is planned to come into effect or come into full operation with the delayed coker in 2023. Most of the engineering has been done according to INA's first quarter 22 financial results, and 80% of the equipment has been delivered. So hopefully that happens. And then we're going to see greater oil production, more white products, higher margins. Maybe that share goes up, maybe not. Nonetheless, maybe within their oil and oil products that it'll change. But anyway, that's 18%. And then you have natural gas at 20-ish, falling, but within in the Northern Adriatic, as George mentioned, making new discoveries, continuing to look for get natural gas. Perhaps that share will also rise over the medium term. So that's production. Let's talk about imports for very quickly. That's production. Here we are at imports, where imports are roughly 8,000 tons of oil equivalent, and they are dominated by oil and oil products, which is normal because you don't have enough crude in Croatia, despite domestic production, to meet all of your needs for refining. And also, you don't. Clearly, it's a market system, open economy. Despite the fact that you have a refinery in Rijeka, you can never expect to meet 100% of your domestic needs through that one refinery. Then we have, so that's oil, and they dominate at 60%. Then we have natural gas imports, which are rising as domestic production is falling, and the rest is essentially electricity and coal to a very small extent. So that's the story there. But the key story is 6 out of 10 units of energy imported is essentially oil and oil products. So let's go and talk about exports, which are not insignificant. I mean, we're talking about almost 3,500 tons of oil equivalent a year. And here again, I mean, it's oil and oil products. That share has been rising in the last few years because INA is part of MOL Group. They have a collection of 5. They have 5 refineries. Clearly, if you own 5 refineries in 3 countries, you're going to optimize. Now, when you look at the statistics, oil exports, mainly to MOL, have gone up. That's an optimization, decision by a private company. How best, to leverage the resources that they have, and that's what's reflected in this rising share of oil products or petroleum products. To make another comment about the Rijeka refinery upgrade and the delayed coker, there will certainly be more white products coming out of Rijeka once the upgrade is done. And my guess is that the share of oil and petroleum exports in total exports of energy product might be the same, but my guess is that we're going to see a slight change, or a reduction, let's say, in crude oil share, and an increase in, refined products. So that's something that I'm expecting, next 5 years, let's say, over the next 5 years, starting in 23, if the refinery upgrade is completed on time. We all hope it will be. Natural gas exports are minor, although you do also have to say, with the LNG terminal coming online and with a large share of that capacity being bought by traders who clearly are using the fact that you have a terminal in Croatia, but are selling on that natural gas elsewhere, Hungary and elsewhere, that share will rise, right?
I think that's going to be a significant change.
Because bear in mind that the LNG terminal began operation in 2021. So we don't have the data yet. It has to be put together. It's better to have good data than, garbage in and garbage out. So, we'll get it towards the end of this year for 21, but certainly expect natural gas share of exports to rise in the overall mix. And with electricity, I mean, that's essentially the top 2 again, renewables and electricity as such. I don't have a view on that. Clearly, if the 3rd block at Krško goes ahead, Croatia is already, generating 15% of its electricity needs through Krško. If it doubles that, or if it goes up to 25%, other aspects, the renewables, the hydro, all the other, the thermoelectric power plants and whatever else, there'll be scope there to export more electricity. And it also depends how how the infrastructure develops, particularly towards Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because, we have 1,000 kilometers, we've got very close relations. And if that infrastructure develops, and there's scope there as well for all energy products. So anyway, that's oil exports, imports, and production. What else have we got here, George? I can't remember.
I want to just make a point before I go to the next slide. I have a bit of control because I'm changing the slides.
No worries.
But I completely agree with everything you're saying. I think the southern interconnector with Bosnia and Herzegovina I'm very confident that's going to proceed.
Yep.
And I think, just like LNG, that'll mean there'll be more natural gas imports and exports from Croatia, which will make energy a higher portion of Croatia's overall GDP.
Yeah, there's a bi-directional gas pipeline with Slovenia as well. Now, back in March, former Prime Minister Janša and Prime Minister Plenković from Croatia talked about, deepening energy cooperation. Obviously, the LNG plant. For years, there's been talk of expanding the capacity, especially from Croatia towards Slovenia on that pipeline, Lučko-Rogatec, I believe. So clearly, if they talked about it back in March, it still hasn't occurred to the full extent. But that's also, apart from BiH, there's the story with Slovenia, because we have had bi-directional flow to Hungary for a while now. I mean, the LNG clearly wouldn't have, the economics would be a lot worse without the bi-directional flows. But that's another thing to bear in mind. And clearly, it's also important to say that Slovenia's new prime minister is from the energy industry. He used to run Geni, Robert Golob. So, obviously relations have improved compared to, the late noughties. Between Ljubljana and Zagreb, there's been a change of government, but we've also got an energy literate prime minister coming in Ljubljana. So at least as far as our industry is concerned, or energy is concerned, that should help. But I also think that, when I look at, I wrote a blog post, one of my 3 years ago, saying that Croatia and Slovenia were natural allies. And I'm still very convinced that I think that, joining the EU hopefully will be in Schengen as well as the Eurozone relatively soon. It'll just deepen economic ties, and the energy sector is certainly one of those where there is a lot of potential. And I would also argue a lot of scope for that potential to be realized in terms of deepening energy ties between the two countries.
I completely agree with you. I think the stars are aligning for more cooperation in the energy field,
which is great, because it would be a great example to the rest of the region, and they need as much optimism as they can get. Next one. All right. This is just basically exports and imports. If you look at the left-hand side, it tells a story of high oil prices, where the share of the contribution to the trade balance was up to 30%. This is an inverted scale on the right-hand side there. They're the dots, the blue dots. And this is the billions of euros, or, millions of euros on the left-hand side of deficit contribution. You can see that the pandemic meant that nothing happened, so there wasn't any activity, and so that fell to zero. But if you're a mercantilist, it looks great, but when you know the context, it really sucks. For this year, I would expect that we're going to be back to 13, 14, 12, 13 levels, as in terms of share of the contribution to the deficit, and in terms of the amounts of euros that we're going to have to be spending on importing natural gas, oil, and oil products. That's just, if I don't conclude that, I'm not being consistent with what George said and what I've been saying. So next time we update this, the light blue bars will be a lot longer and the dot will be a lot closer to the axis. Yeah. So that's that. But
if I can add here, if Croatia moves forward now with offshore oil and gas exploration and production, 5 years from now, those light blue bars can be much smaller.
Yep.
And that's the key.
Yeah,
that's where the opportunity is.
Yep. That's one of the ways it'll be reflected. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. The data that I have in the coming slides and what I had for now is, clearly, Eurostat data provided by the Croatian Bureau of Statistics. But clearly it doesn't reflect what's happening now. And all just wanted to do very, very quickly. So London gas oil futures prices last night when I completed this. Look at down here at, this is in dollars. That looks like you're scaling Mount Everest the last few months. That's when George says 6 times. This is diesel prices, right? Gas oil is diesel, right? Which is the lifeblood of industrial production, and at least as far as transport, private transport is concerned in Europe as well. Nat gas prices, these are North America. Yeah, it's way higher than the Rocky Mountains, but again, it's gone up over the last few months. So this is just to prove, to provide, further corroboration to George's point about 6 times. On the natural gas side, we didn't find the European data, but nonetheless, they say pictures tell are worth 1,000 words. Here's a couple of thousand words. So let's go on to the next one where we talk about diesel and petrol prices. So the European Union, this is the DG Energy. On a weekly basis, they tell you how much you're paying for diesel, which is the left one, the blue. And petrol prices, right? So in Croatia, it's €77 a litre if you're listing from North America, right? Not a gallon a litre, and it's euros. Given the euro is depreciating and heading towards some sort of parity with the US dollar, it's roughly, it's almost that many dollars per litre. So multiply by what, 4.4 or 4.2?
3.6 per gallon.
3.6. It's 3. A lot more. It's a lot more than what you're paying in
the US.
In the US, yeah. And it's worse if you're sitting in Sweden or Germany. Petrol prices are lower on average. There's another graph that they provide, which is in yellow, that tells you the tax take. Now, putting 3 of these in would just be, forcing it. So I put it in the headline. The way the tax system works, the excise tax system in particular, and then not add on VAT and any other levies. What it means is that retail diesel prices, that left one there, €77 in Croatia, it means that it's slightly less in Croatia, but on average, 50% of the prices goes to the government. So excise taxes, where the European Commission puts a floor, you can't go below that. I think it's from memory, €330 per 1,000 litres for diesel. They do the same for petrol. There, it's roughly 40% on average. But anyway, just so you know. And the next next slide. So we're getting towards the end here. Here, I sort of made a little bit of, I had a look at EU average, Croatia, and immediate neighbours, and had a look at the price of nat gas, right? So we're talking, EU average is, let's say, 5 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Croatia is slightly below that. Slovenia is, 5.5 euro cents per square kilowatt hour. And Hungary is even more than that, 5.6. Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia are lower, but they're also not in the EU, so the share of their tax take is a lot lower. When you look at it for natural gas, Croatia is there or thereabouts. 26.4% is the share of taxes in the EU. For Croatia, it's almost 24%. In Slovenia, it's 28%, and in Hungary, it's 38%, which then explains why their total price. And this is for non-households, so this is for industry, right? And it's for the second half of last year, because that's the latest data that we have to be able to do a comparison. My guess is that the shares will basically be the same, but this brown line will be, probably, if I looked at first half 2022, would be much higher. So that axis on the right-hand side. Yeah. But anyway, that's gas, right? It's supply costs are relatively competitive. And in terms of electricity, again, Croatia's there or thereabouts with EU average when we're talking about industrial users between 500 and 2,000 megawatt hours per year in the second half of last year. The tax take is there or thereabouts as well. Yeah, I would argue that Slovenia's that cost of supply is lower because their share of electricity from nuclear power is much higher than in Croatia. And in the EU, taxes, they on average in the EU, basically saying Western Europe, the taxes there make much more, provide much more of a make much more of a contribution. My guess, and I'm not sure what you think, George, is that the Energiewende in Germany and the de facto subsidization of non-households. Oh yeah, thankfully I didn't show that, but in Germany means that the tax take is higher. But again, we're talking about non-households here, industrial users. But in Western Europe, the tax take is higher. But that's the story there in any event. But more or less, it's saying Croatia's there or thereabouts in both senses, for both sources of energy, and there's not too much more scope for increasing. There is scope for increasing the tax take, but longer term, if you're looking from an investment perspective, as a potential investor in Croatia, then when you see this, that you're there or thereabouts in terms of cost of energy. Right, and the last one, I believe, here's some thoughts. It is updated compared to 18 months ago. You will see that. I did mention Russia's invasion. The views are the same, except that now we've got even more of a reason. It's more serious now. Let's be perfectly honest. It's a question of, do you have access to energy? Croatia thankfully has a coastline, which means that have security of supply. The LNG plants up and running. Compared to 5 years ago, definitely, we're far more connected. There's more scope, as George mentioned, towards Bosnia and Herzegovina and also Slovenia for natural gas. But the point is, you need baseload, you need reliable, efficient, stable sources of power. No one's saying renewables are bad, but they're part of the mix, and we have to be realistic. Again, here I'll underline that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has definitely pushed Europe and the US to really think even harder about how to make renewables operational, how to deal with energy storage, specifically electricity storage issues, thinking about the electricity grids, the whole suite. In the long term, like I said, I wouldn't want to be, a Russian attempting to sell hydrocarbons because it's going to be much harder after this. In the immediate term, sure, we're going to ratchet up, reliance on fossil fuels to make sure we get through the next winter, to make sure that industrial production continues as much as it can. But already, I think nuclear as well in the context of the EU will have more importance in the energy mix. It's consistent, certainly, with net zero goals. And this has been, a wake-up call. It's not a welcome wake-up call, but it's a wake-up call nonetheless. And I would argue that the European Union is responding. And let's say if we do this in 18 months' time, I'm sure that we're going to have even more arguments to be able to support that contention. Because as I said, Lithuania, Poland pipeline open. You saw also, this is also important to say in the regional context, JANAF, the oil pipeline company, back in what was it, late March, said that by the 15th of May, they would have to, because of EU sanctions on Russian-owned companies, stop supplying the Pančevo refinery in Serbia, owned by Naftna Industrija Serbia, and the petrochemicals plant. In the meantime, the European Union rejigged their sanctions regime, and thankfully that supply is no longer in question. Why do I say thankfully? Bear in mind that JANAF worked all the way through the homeland war. So anyone that needed crude oil through JANAF got it, including Serbia. So, and that's a positive story as well. And I also just want to underline George's point that there's value in exploring and supporting the use of new technologies. And in this case, we're talking about, hydrocarbon development. Also, if you go and drill for oil, let's say, you may not find it. Like Montenegro so far hasn't found anything, if I'm not mistaken, George.
That's correct.
Right. but you've got to think about, you've got to be realistic. And again, this for Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainian people, and in Croatia and in Bosnia, and on Kosovo, there's a lot more understanding for them. This is a tough time, and I think everyone who's fair-minded understands that. But because of that, certain, the day of reckoning in terms of European energy policy has been brought forward. And I mean, it's a new world. We don't need to be, we need to be open-minded. We need to make sure that we leverage the advantages that we have. We've got a coastline, we've got the LNG plant. That demonstrates that Croatia can, together with its partners, make long-term important strategic decisions. And with a couple of wins under our belt, which clearly help improve not only Croatia's energy security of energy supply, but also the EU. It's nice as a smaller member state to make that contribution, to think long and hard about how we can leverage the knowledge which is undeniable in Croatia. There's no lack of capital. Joining the Eurozone will make it even easier. And to develop the hydrocarbons and the energy resources that we have, while at the same time doing absolutely everything in our power to meet our net zero goals. But in the context of 2022 and the 22-23 winter, to make sure first and foremost that we actually have the energy that we need. And price is, let's be perfectly honest, at this point, not an unimportant factor, but it's definitely secondary, because first of all, you actually need the energy. Then we'll talk about paying for it. So let's end on that positive note, George, unless you have any comments.
Well, I do have a comment. We're going to have a follow-up session with questions.
Yep.
So Goran's email address is here.
Yep.
So you can contact Goran or myself with your questions, and we're going to get together in a couple of weeks.
That's right.
Considering it's a very dynamic environment, I'm sure there's going to be many things to talk about.
More developments which would have made it into the presentation had we had it in a couple of weeks.
So thank you. Thank you. This has been great. It's always a pleasure doing these webinars with you.
Oh, thanks. It's nice to make use of technology, given that you might be 9 hours behind, but institutionally you're ahead.
Perfect team.
Yeah.
And just to recap, there is a crisis going on, energy crisis, but it's full of opportunities for Croatia. So it's not bleak, it's positive. It's an opportunity just to get focused and make it better for the next crisis. One thing we know about energy prices, they're going to go up and they're going to go down. We just don't know when.
Yeah, we just don't know when. And I think, again, I think the West in the last couple of months has definitely proven that it's flexible, that when things get, when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Yep.
Right. That the systems that we use to organize society are very flexible, and we can deal with an awful lot, and we have dealt with an awful lot just over the last decade, from a migrant crisis, to energy, the energy crisis here, various political, challenges that the EU, the US has faced, Canada, others in the West. We can deal with this, and we've proven it time and time again.
Yeah, Goran, I love your analogy with the hand of cards that Croatia was dealt. Croatia's done phenomenally well.
Yep. No, absolutely. I mean, I've been living here for 23 years, and I was convinced when I got here, which is why I stayed, that we joined NATO and the EU. I mean, I tell my clients, if I were an Australian of Macedonian or Serbian extraction, I wouldn't be living in Skopje or Belgrade. I don't think so. I may not have stayed in Australia. I may be in Canada, the US, London, who knows, somewhere in the EU. But the likelihood of me being in Zagreb today and for the past 23 years would have been greatly reduced had I not been convinced, and had basically the Croatian, people, I mean, the residents of Croatia, the voting public, the body politic, clearly not decided to join NATO and the EU, which has absolutely helped Croatia in every aspect, not just in economic.
Brilliant. So thank you, Crodiaspora. Great to do these webinars, and thank you everybody that's going to be watching this. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Cheers.